What does this all-time high mean for you?
It's absolutely wild. I think that when I think back to 2013, if you had told me what would the world look like when Bitcoin hit $100,000, I would have said that we'd all be using Bitcoin. It would have become the standard, and we're not there yet. So it's at once bearish and bullish.
If we did have this internet money that, as you've said, has grown from the ground up, and we do see Bitcoin and the story of it 10 years from now, how will this look on a use case level?
Bitcoin, I think it will be money, right? It will be money, but it will also be money moving and operating in a way that we really can't imagine yet. We've never had anything at that scale.
Okay, hello everyone, and welcome back to the Binance Studios. Now I'm extremely excited to introduce our next guest. We are joined by one and only Pete Rizzo, Bitcoin historian and editor-in-chief of Bitcoin Magazine. Now, Pete has actually spent over a decade documenting the most pivotal moments in Bitcoin's journey. If there's one person you should follow on X to cover all things Bitcoin, it should be Pete. Now, in this episode, we're going to get his take on some of the biggest and boldest Bitcoin quotes of 2025. We'll unpack what these moments and also what the current price means for Bitcoin and where things could be headed next. So Pete, first of all, thank you so much for joining us. Great to see you. It's been a while since Bitcoin Mina, where we met last. How has everything been? How are you doing?
Yeah, it must be good luck. Last time we met each other was all-time high, and now it's all-time high again. So we got to keep this thing going.
We will try and make monthly, quarterly at least, just to keep the momentum. Absolutely, you've mentioned all-time high there. So as of kind of Wednesday evening, Thursday, Dubai time, I know you're based in the US, Bitcoin hit $112,000, new all-time high. How does it feel? How is the sentiment? What is your gauge as someone that has been in crypto for over a decade, one of the Bitcoin OGs? What does this all-time high mean for you?
Yeah, it's absolutely wild. I think that when I think back to 2013, when I was first, kind of getting immersed into the Bitcoin world, if you had told me what would the world look like when Bitcoin hit $100,000, I would have said that we'd all be using Bitcoin. It would have become the standard, and we're not there yet. So it's at once bearish and bullish, right? The bullish case is that we really do have so much farther to go. And yes, people really, even at $100,000 Bitcoin, don't seem to be waking up. Sats, you can still get 1,000 sats for under $1. We're still early, which is nice, but it's certainly interesting reflecting on how much has been built out. But certainly we're getting mainstream, right? It's starting to feel like we're knocking on some doors, and that this time next year there's going to be a major integration of Bitcoin and crypto into most applications, financial applications, and banks in the United States. So it feels like it's happening.
Absolutely. Yes. The atmosphere now is definitely different and all for better. And it seems that 2024 and 2025 absolutely have been Bitcoin's year. And it seems that onwards and upwards, the momentum is only getting stronger. As you mentioned, publicly listed companies adding Bitcoin to balance sheet, governments adding strategic Bitcoin reserves. And I'm going to pull in some tweets and posts here just to get the narration from you as a true Bitcoin OG, what this means for the market. First one that I want to share is something that you shared just a few hours ago. Bloomberg charts now showing that Bitcoin's price is measured in millions. Get prepared, it's coming. So for people that are new to crypto, new to Bitcoin, talk us through what this chart means and why you are so pumped to share it on X.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, an incredible thing to see, right? Bitcoin is a internet currency that was kind of bootstrapped from nothing, just from a peer-to-peer network of computers, right? So you got to think that all the way back in 2009, 2010, maybe there was as few as, a handful of computers, maybe 10 or less, running the Bitcoin software and downloading Bitcoin and using the Bitcoin wallet, right? So Bitcoin does come from this history of being essentially worthless, right? People were, some of the first miners of Bitcoin were actually, spending money, right? You had to spend electricity and computing cycles in order to acquire Bitcoins. They're actually losing money acquiring Bitcoin. So to think that we've come this far, right? These Bitcoins that have been created are now so valuable that Bloomberg is measuring the chart in millions. I just thought it was a funny commentary on the times, right? We're always kind of saying that, it's early, that we're getting prepared for kind of this great future of Bitcoin. But here's a great visual chart where, people in the mainstream who maybe aren't advocates for us, are sending a quiet signal that they think it's possible that this reality that we've been prophesizing it might be coming to pass. But, in reality, it's probably a quirk of the charts. But, again, I think it sends a strong signal that, Bitcoin does have far to go, right? The government's not using it. A lot of these public companies, this has been a big trend I've been spending a lot of time following over the last couple of weeks, not buying Bitcoin, right? They're raising money to buy Bitcoin, but in very few cases is that Bitcoin actually being bought. So there's plenty of bid left on Bitcoin and reasons to think it will keep getting more valuable. And obviously it's a network where the more people use it, the more valuable it becomes. And a lot of reasons to be optimistic.
Absolutely. Now it's time to move over to some of the architecture points of Bitcoin. So next up, we have Michael Saylor at Bitcoin 2025. I will read this to you because I realize the font is a little small here. Michael Saylor seems to be kind of one of the main driving forces that people do come and speak at cryptocurrency conferences around the world. And he has been all in on Bitcoin for many years. And in one kind of caption of this quote in particular, it was, "Clarity comes the moment you realize that Bitcoin is capital, perfected capital, programmable capital, and incorruptible capital." And I think we have a lot of new retail audience that do watch the Binance YouTube channel, and they are constantly getting into the industry and looking to understand a little bit more. So on an entry level, I would love, Pete, for you just to walk us through, maybe just as a starting point, why Michael Saylor is just so bullish on Bitcoin.
Well, that's a great question. I had a chance to sit down with Michael at the Blockworks Digital Asset Summit early this year and got to kind of peek into his brain about it. But I think that quote sums it up, right? I think Michael Saylor is an entrepreneur who, has his career spans decades, right? You can go back to the 1990s. He was one of the internet pioneers and really saw that network expanding and being useful for businesses. And I think this quote that you just mentioned is him adapting Bitcoin for that audience, right? Again, if you think about who are Michael Saylor's peers, it's not your Vitalik Buterins, it's not your CZs. It's someone like, a Bill Gates or a Michael Dell, right? People who kind of pioneered the early internet infrastructure. Of course, he had some ups and downs, right? There's the famous news article where he lost $6 billion in a single day because MicroStrategy IPO'd. It went up, his company went down. And, I think really, to understand Michael's view on Bitcoin and Michael's story, you need to understand that he's a successful entrepreneur who really felt that after decades in his career, even building a really powerful mid-sized company that, now is on the verge of maybe entering the S&P, he wasn't getting ahead. And he didn't think that was because, of his particular business acumen. It's just that it's difficult managing your finances as a company. So I think one of the real genius insights that Michael had, and I think it's actually amazing how long it's taken the wider ecosystem to wake up to this, but there's a lot that we evangelize Bitcoin where we talk about individuals, right? You and I might buy Bitcoin to protect ourselves from inflation and grow our purchasing power to increase our wealth. All of that applies to businesses, right? And I think Michael was really the first person to see that in a basic sense, the same reasons that an individual would buy Bitcoin, it made a lot of sense for businesses to buy Bitcoin. And I think what we really saw was that idea, as simple as it might be, was 4 years ahead of its time, right? And now companies around the world are waking up and saying, we can buy Bitcoin too. We can use Bitcoin as money. We can denominate our business in Bitcoin, and we'll gain, right? And there's a lot of really interesting success stories, from people who have followed Michael. So one that I love to talk about is this. There's this small kind of Middle Eastern restaurant chain in Canada that in 2020 started buying Bitcoin, and now they're a much larger chain, right? They were able to develop and add more locations simply because they own Bitcoin. There's a limited supply cap of Bitcoin. That will never be changed. They can hold their own Bitcoin, and that Bitcoin grew in value over time. They're able to invest in the business, right? So compare that to Canadian dollars in the case of Tahinis, or dollars in the case of MicroStrategy and Strategy and Saylor. It's that if you're a business, losing 8% or 10% on inflation, that's meaningful, right? So it's meaningful for the individual. It's meaningful for the company, and I think we're really just starting to see companies wake up to that. And also, he's done a lot of other innovative things in terms of realizing that businesses have access to capital in ways that individuals don't, right? You and I might be able to take out a loan and buy Bitcoin, but companies can as well. And in some cases, they're able to get, much more favorable rates. So I really think you're about to see, and I'm expecting, a really big wave of exploration here, right? Where this really could be a 3 to 5 year trend of businesses coming on and kind of powering the next wave of Bitcoin adoption.
Absolutely. And he's absolutely set a very strong tone there. I think it's fascinating if you look back at some of Saylor's previous comments. particularly on Apple in 2008, he was speaking out about how everyone will be using a smartphone and carrying the device with them. And I think he has a very fantastic overview and kind of holistic tunnel vision of what the future consumers and also institutions really look for. And that is kind of testament with his narrative around Bitcoin. Now, I do have to add on, because this was not part of the scheduled show, but seeing the fantastic Buy Bitcoin sign behind you in the camera, I just thought we should just give a recap for everyone that is watching on why the piece of paper behind you that says Buy Bitcoin is just so iconic. Can you talk us through that as the Bitcoin historian, what this kind of quirky little story means for the industry?
Yeah, I would love to. This is one of the deep cuts in the lore of Bitcoin. I'll take you all the way back to the summer of 2017. Bitcoin back then under a lot of pressure, kind of emerging in the mainstream. Bitcoin has this explosion in 2013 where it's this breakout, darling currency that, Silicon Valley sort of loves. But then we have the 2014-15 crash, right? You see the kind of the big tech figureheads kind of abandon it, leave it for dead. And in 2017, we see the resurgence, right? We see suddenly there's a reactivation and reinterest in Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies because of explosion in, price. Back then that meant Bitcoin, going from a couple $100s to $2,000 when this photo was taken. And so, the setting here is essentially this is the Federal Reserve Chair testifying before Congress. If you've seen the last few days, all the pressure that we've seen on the current Fed chair, and testifying before Congress, right? This is Janet Yellen, the then Fed chair, testifying before Congress about how the Fed was going to manage interest rates. And lo and behold, we had a bit of a stowaway here. So this was a young law firm intern by the name of Christian Langalis. If you look at my Twitter, you can go into the highlights. You'll find kind of threads on the legends of the space. Christian, definitely a legend of his time, decided to kind of scrawl on his legal pad some advice for the viewers at home who are watching this televised Senate hearing. And, here we have the exact moment where he sort of flashed his Buy Bitcoin sign in front of the camera, and it really just went viral, right? So like instantaneously, I remember being in the CoinDesk newsroom when the photo was shared on Twitter, very quickly it was on CNBC, and it was like a moon landing moment, right? I remember being with this kind of group of journalists and we're just kind of staring at our desks. Ash Bennington, who's now over at Real Vision, I just kind of perched with like a, hand over his mouth, kind of like watching this because it was a very rebellious moment, right? It was a sense that Bitcoin was, and Christian in this case was, kind of sending a message to the Federal Reserve to kind of, one up them or, send just a strong signal, right, of support to the community. And so anyway, he was whisked away. And, by the time he went back to his, desk at his day job, people were very upset, but he was an internet celebrity, right? So people kind of raised money for him around the internet. And he was anonymous for many years, right? So he's recently kind of unveiled himself, but he was an anonymous, kind of person or, called Bitcoin sign guy. And he would appear at events and fundraisings. And last summer, as part of his kind of, public reveal, he did auction off the original Buy Bitcoin sign. So that sign that you're looking at right there sold for about $1 million, 16 BTC, probably now north of $1 million, close to $1.6 million. But yeah, amazing story. And I really, CoinDesk that year made Christian and Bitcoin sign guy the person of the year. And I actually got to write the story on him. And I felt really strongly about that choice, right? He was kind of an emblematic of this kind of user base that had really pushed Bitcoin through, right? This difficult time that we were talking about and refused to let Bitcoin die. Really a great moment in Bitcoin history. I encourage you to check it out. And that article is still on CoinDesk, his most influential article, and also the thread on my Twitter account where I recount the story. Definitely a must read.
Amazing. Fantastic. Thank you so much. And we can see the homage there behind you, which is very cool. Okay, so next up, we're going to move over into someone slightly larger on the institutional side than the Bitcoin sign guy. We're moving over to Larry Fink. So in January 2025, we saw BlackRock CEO Larry Fink make headlines saying Bitcoin could reach $700,000 per coin. And I'm curious to hear, Pete, when it comes to legacy finance driving price narrative now over grassroots Bitcoin adoption on the ground at a retail level, what's your take? How do you feel? And what do you feel when you see these kind of price predictions?
Well, look, Bitcoin is for everyone, right? And it's ultimately going to be adopted by everyone, every institution, every government and individual. I think in this case, BlackRock really was just a pioneer, right? They were one of the financial institutions on Wall Street that was early, right? There are still some of BlackRock's peers that are not open to Bitcoin, right? So you think about Vanguard and other financial institutions where, right now you can't purchase the Bitcoin ETF in your Vanguard account. So BlackRock very much at this time in 2025 and in 2024 when they really started their push into Bitcoin, early, right? And now you've seen it pay off, right? The Bitcoin ETF that they have has amassed 700,000 Bitcoin. It's on the terms of the fees that they're making on it, it's almost as profitable as their S&P 500 ETF that came out a few weeks ago. So I think that this is just going to send really strong signals to the entire Wall Street industry to take Bitcoin much more seriously. But I do think that Wall Street is going to embrace the full asset class, right? So you're seeing even the BlackRocks of the world kind of take a look at other areas of the ecosystem where they see innovation. But yeah, I think this is going to be the big story this year. And for the rest of this, bull cycle, however long it lasts, is the public markets realizing and now being able to, the first time with some of this regulation finally passing, be an active participant in the Bitcoin markets. We simply have never seen, a world where the kind of access you have to assets on a major crypto exchange and the kind of access to assets you have on, say, a NASDAQ or Fidelity or something like that are the same, right? This has been a bifurcated ecosystem. And, in 6 months to a year, I don't think that's going to be the case, right? I think the experience that you have on a crypto exchange app is going to look very similar to the experience that you have on a banking app. Some of that's going to be with stablecoins first, but I think very quickly you're going to see these kind of applications come to parity, right? They're going to start looking like finance, right? Because crypto and Bitcoin are going to be what finance is. If you think about, I was thinking about the other day about the word stablecoins and tokenization and just kind of, what's implicit in that. And when you think about tokenization or stablecoins, what's happening, right? What it sounds like, oh, you're putting dollars on a blockchain. But I also like to think about it that you're making dollars and traditional assets like Bitcoin compatible. I almost wish that was the way we phrased it, right? Like this is the traditional finance world becoming Bitcoin compatible. Like Bitcoin started, it was this innovation. And now, this is what tokenization is. It's making the great amount of crypto assets or traditional assets out there Bitcoin compatible. And so maybe I'll leave you with that phrase as like a different way to think about it.
Fantastic. I like that. And I think it follows quite nicely on because as we've got here, Bitwise has put out this infographic that is pretty orange bullish. 125 public companies are now having or holding Bitcoin. Companies are buying Bitcoin, and that is something that we have had build up from, I guess, 2023 really quite significantly. There's been a change of momentum when it comes to this. We know companies are buying Bitcoin. We know institutions are here, but I'm curious to ask you, Pete, what is making you so excited about Bitcoin as of July 2025?
Yeah, a great question. I think that this explosion of interest that you're seeing with these companies, I think this is just getting started. And I don't even mean that. And, I don't even know if we can say that we're early in Bitcoin anymore, but this is early, right? So what's happening here? I think I was at the permissionless summit at the Blockworks through a couple of weeks ago, and I was just shocked by the number of people who just weren't taking public company adoption of Bitcoin seriously. I personally have spent the last 3 or 4 weeks really diving into this subsector of the industry. I think that this is where, as I said, over the next 3 to 5 years, things are going to be headed. I mean, as you said, there's 200 companies, public companies buying Bitcoin. But if you assume that every public company in the world will ultimately own some Bitcoin because Bitcoin is just a store of value and money, I mean, the total addressable market for companies is in the hundreds of thousands, if not millions, if not even higher than that. So, let's just say like bitcointreasuries.net, right? That's the famous site right now that kind of tracks all of this data. This reminds me of CoinMarketCap in 2017. I used to follow CoinMarketCap when you could fit all the assets that were in the crypto world on a single page, and I would look at the, CoinMarketCap every day and, I'd say, I was the editor at CoinDesk at the time, and I would say, yeah, maybe we should add Litecoin, maybe we should add Ethereum. And by the time, it became obvious that there were going to be thousands of cryptocurrencies, there was no choice, no chance. And so I think, if you think about what's happening on Bitcoin treasuries, that site is like an interesting snapshot, because I think this goes to 2,000, 3,000 companies that are doing this. And again, if you think about the long-term trends, right? Like why wouldn't this happen? If you expect all companies to own Bitcoin and use Bitcoin as money, as operating capital, the way that individuals have, this could be a huge unlock for Bitcoin. So yeah, I think the Bitcoin treasury narrative is very easy to write off as a gimmick. I understand why a lot of people are doing it, but it also has that sweet spot kind of classic crypto thing where, I remember covering stablecoins where they came out. Everyone thought stablecoins were a bad idea. They were like dollars on a blockchain. Like, who would do that? NFTs, the same thing. Everybody thought they were very dumb. And the Bitcoin treasuries feel similar. It's almost like this idea that is, it's so easy to pass over. It's like, oh, well, these companies are raising debt and equity to buy Bitcoin. Oh, that'll pass, right? That's the initial reaction that I think a lot of people have. And what I would ask people, at home, as you're looking at one of these sites like Bitcoin treasuries or whatever, think about what happens if that isn't the case. Think about what happens if this becomes, the way that retail is now getting onboarded to Bitcoin. Because again, like we really haven't seen that many of these companies buy. Nakamoto raised $750 million, has bought 21 Bitcoin, hasn't spent that money. Sequans today buying 300 Bitcoin, has enough money to buy thousands more, right? So we're just not seeing the capital that's getting raised translating to buys, but that's going to happen. Or when that happens, I think you're going to see a wave of other businesses pick up on this, because, Metaplanet and MicroStrategy, I mean, these are the best performing stocks in the world. Metaplanet has one hotel. It's the 7th most valuable hotel company in the world right now. And so I think that there's a space race to replicate what these companies have done. And I think that this can be replicated in every public market, especially when you look at how Metaplanet, has been successful, weak yen, no domestic ETF, really bad tax regime if you buy and sell Bitcoin over spot. There's 30 to 40 other capital markets where you could launch a similar company. And if the end result of you launching that company is that you have 30,000 Bitcoin, sign me up. Where do I go? Where do I go to register that company and start buying Bitcoin, right? So I really think that people are underselling what could happen here, right? One of the things that you kind of see over time in cryptocurrency is like identifying these exponential trends. Like this one really could be exponential. I think a lot of people are sleeping on it.
And now, finally, I want to wrap up with Michael Saylor's 21 rules of Bitcoin that we hear when he speaks at his conferences around the world. And I'm curious to ask you, Pete Rizzo, the Bitcoin historian, if you had a few rules for understanding Bitcoin, what would those rules be? Could you give us one or two off the top of your head? I know it's a tough question, but for retail investors, people like you and me that are looking to get in the space, what are the rules that we need to keep in mind?
That's an interesting idea. Yeah, the 21 rules of speech. I've seen it a couple of times. I'm not sure if I agree with all the rules, but that's an interesting attempt, I think, to define, and give people a guide map for what Bitcoin is, right? For people at home, I just say the rule about Bitcoin is try to take a step back and realize what's happening, right? And think creatively and think outside the mold, that you've really been living in, right? So I think that's the tough thing with Bitcoin is really, because again, it's an outlandish story. I remember when I heard it, I didn't believe it. And your tendency is so I guess my one rule is suspend your disbelief. Suspend your disbelief. There's one great quote that Alan Farrington has. It's said a lot, but it's a simple rhetorical question, and it goes like this. What would it look like if a global money was bootstrapping from zero and spreading slowly around the globe? What would that look like? And I think anyone new to Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies has to ask themselves this question. If we were to migrate the entirety of the world over to a new money, a global money that everyone in the world could access and that everyone would use every day, if that was happening, what would it look like? And how would that change come to pass? And I think that it's a powerful statement, because that is really what's happening with Bitcoin, right? We are now storing our time and energy in these government-run databases. That's what you're doing. If you're earning fiat money and saving it, you are storing your time and energy in a government-run database. You now have a choice to not do that and to store your time, value, and energy in a global database that is more expansive than anything we've seen before. And you do have that choice, right? And I think a lot of people aren't really presented that choice with much clarity. I see this a lot with the journalists, right? A lot of journalists pretend that they don't have this choice, or that there aren't implications, for your choice. So, maybe I guess what I would leave with new people, not a rule, but you have a choice to spend your time and energy and to put that somewhere and to store that somewhere. And you now have a choice that is different from the traditional kind of government run system that you've maybe known and been born into. So I guess the question I'd leave people with is, if you had another option, would you take it? And I'd invite people to think critically about that.
And final thought, because now that I have you here, I have to ask, that was a really powerful quote that you've cited from Alan there. 10 years from now, what would that look like if we did have this internet money that, as you've said, has grown from the ground up, and we do see Bitcoin and the story of it 10 years from now? How will this look on a use case level? And also, what part of this journey, which will mean you will have been in Bitcoin for 20 years, would you have been most proud of to contribute to?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. When you look at technology trends, some of the things I like to tell or remind new people about are kind of the sillier elements, right? I was walking with a friend the other day. We were talking about, the transition with Bitcoin we've seen in our lives. And I said, you think about the 1800s, so you brought somebody back from that time, they'd be like, where are the balloon cities? Why aren't there people living in the clouds? Why do I not see any floating flying cars and cities, right? So it's really hard to predict what the future is going to look like. And in a lot of cases, our attempts to look at the future are very silly. There's another famous video from the 1900s World Fair where they basically, unveil this robot, and they're like, there's going to be a robot in every home. And the robot sort of comes out and it's like reading a newspaper and it's smoking a cigarette. And so, that's not true. You don't have a robot in your home, but you have computers everywhere, right? I'm surrounded by computers. So I think it's at once really hard to kind of imagine the future, right? Because we're so limited by our own experiences. But, Bitcoin, I think, in the future, it will be money, right? It will be money, but it will also be money moving and operating in a way that we really can't imagine yet, because it's really not, we've never had anything at that scale, right? So I think that, I like to use these earlier kind of analogies, because I think that, as much as we think we know where it's going, I don't think we can know where it's going, right? That's just going to be figured out in time. And to myself, well, I have been most proud about for 20 years. Oh boy, that's a tough one. I would have hoped to contributed that, maybe through some of my work on Twitter and elsewhere, people were able to kind of understand more about Bitcoin history. And I hope to kind of, create a catalog for that. Cause I do think that, this transition to a new money system, it's going to be difficult. There's going to be winners and losers. There's no easy way to think about that. A lot of people, I think, are going to be really have a lot of frustration and a lot of anger, at the fact that they'll be migrating to a new system, perhaps even against, or, under less favorable economic, situations. So I try to approach those people with empathy and say that I hope to be able to explain this transition to people and understand that maybe, not everyone will be happy about that, right? As I said, that it's just a fact that there are 21 million Bitcoin. You get the price that you deserve. We're migrating slowly to this new system, but that's going to change the world, right? It's going to change how capital is allocated. It's going to change who owns that capital. And as I said, I think we haven't seen the real end of that story yet, and I hope to stick around for it.
Absolutely. On behalf of everyone, thank you for all the work that you do. I am going to leave the links to your socials. So for anyone that has watched this interview and wants to learn more about Pete and that you're not following him already, you can absolutely make sure to do so. Pete, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you diving deep in, and especially on such a all-time high week. So it's a pleasure to see you, and hopefully we'll see you in the UAE for the next batch of cryptocurrency conferences. But thank you so much for the time today.
Would love that. Appreciate you having me. And thanks to everybody for checking out this video.
Yeah, thank you so much. And guys, thank you so much for watching. If you've not yet, do make sure to subscribe to the channel to not miss more interviews like this.